When Jake woke up to find a woman removing her clothes and climbing into his bed, he never expected it would lead to the most meaningful friendship of his life. Jake had been living by himself for exactly 93 days. Not that he was counting or anything, but when you go from sharing a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with your best friend since college to suddenly having the whole place to yourself, you notice these things. The silence was the weirdest part. No more midnight gaming sessions bleeding through thin walls. No more arguments about whose turn it was to buy groceries. And definitely no more random friends crashing on the couch after late nights out. His apartment building was one of those old brick structures that you find scattered throughout downtown areas of mid-sized cities. The kind of place where the elevator made suspicious groaning noises and the heating system had a personality of its own. But the rent was something a 26-year-old marketing coordinator could actually afford. And walking to work took him exactly 12 minutes if he caught all the lights right. The neighbors were an interesting mix. Mrs. Patterson lived directly above him, and every morning at 6:30 sharp, he could hear her doing what sounded like some kind of exercise routine. It took him 3 weeks to realize it was Tai Chi when he bumped into her in the hallway wearing loose pants and comfortable shoes, moving with the grace of someone half her age. She always smiled and asked how he was settling in, which made him feel less like a stranger in his own building. Next door in apartment 3A lived 2 college students who seemed to survive entirely on energy drinks and determination. He'd hear them studying late into the night, occasionally breaking into heated discussions about organic chemistry or philosophical theories he'd forgotten since his own college days. They were quiet enough that he never felt the need to complain, and sometimes their passionate debates about academic topics actually helped him fall asleep. The mystery tenant was in 4B, directly above the college students. Jake had seen glimpses of this person coming and going at odd hours, always carrying what looked like a work bag and moving with the tired shuffle of someone who worked long, irregular shifts. Sometimes he'd hear footsteps at 2 in the morning, sometimes at dawn. He'd created an entire backstory in his head about this neighbor being either a night shift nurse, a firefighter, or maybe someone who worked at the 24-hour diner down the street. Jake's new job at Morrison Marketing had been going well enough. It wasn't his dream career, but it paid the bills and gave him health insurance, which felt pretty adult and responsible. His co-workers were friendly, and his boss seemed reasonable as long as deadlines got met. The work involved creating social media campaigns for local businesses, which meant he spent a lot of time thinking about how to make hardware stores and coffee shops sound exciting online. This particular Thursday had started normally enough. Jake woke up feeling slightly off, but attributed it to the change in weather. October had arrived with its usual unpredictability, swinging between warm afternoons and chilly mornings that left everyone unsure how to dress. He'd made it through his morning routine, grabbed coffee and a breakfast sandwich from the corner shop, and settled into his desk at work. By lunchtime, that slightly off feeling had evolved into something more concerning. His head felt heavy, his throat scratched when he swallowed, and concentrating on his computer screen required more effort than usual. When his supervisor noticed him rubbing his temples during their 2 o'clock meeting, she suggested he might want to head home early. The walk back to his apartment felt longer than usual. The 12-minute journey stretched into what felt like 20, as Jake found himself stopping more frequently, his energy draining with each block. By the time he climbed the 2 flights of stairs to his floor, he was breathing harder than seemed reasonable for such a simple task. Inside his apartment, Jake immediately changed into comfortable clothes and collapsed onto his couch. The fever hit him like a wall around 4 in the afternoon. 1 minute he was watching television and feeling merely unwell. The next he was shivering under 2 blankets while his skin felt like it was on fire. The classic signs of the flu that had been making rounds through his office building. He managed to text his sister Amy, letting her know he was sick. She responded immediately with the kind of concern that only siblings possess, threatening to drive over with soup and medicine. Jake assured her he just needed rest and that he'd call if things got worse. Amy had her own life to manage, including 2 young kids and a husband who traveled for work. The last thing she needed was to catch his flu. But Amy being Amy, she insisted on having his spare key so she could check on him the next day if he wasn't answering his phone. Jake had given her the key months ago anyway, right after he'd moved in, because having someone nearby who could access his place in an emergency seemed like responsible adult behavior. As Thursday evening arrived, Jake found himself drifting in and out of sleep on his couch. The fever made everything feel surreal and disconnected. Sounds from the hallway seemed both too loud and too distant. The light coming through his windows shifted strangely, making familiar objects in his apartment appear foreign and somehow significant. Around 8 o'clock, he decided to move to his bedroom, thinking that proper sleep in an actual bed might help his body fight off whatever virus had taken hold. The short walk from his living room to his bedroom felt like a major expedition, and by the time he crawled under his covers, he was exhausted all over again. His apartment door was unlocked because Amy had said she might stop by after putting her kids to bed, depending on how her evening went. In his fevered state, Jake had forgotten to mention this detail to her during their text exchange, but he figured she'd either show up or she wouldn't. Either way, the door being unlocked would save her from having to use the key if she decided to check on him. The building's old radiator system clanked and hissed as evening settled in, creating the kind of background noise that was somehow comforting when you were feeling unwell. Jake pulled his blankets up to his chin and closed his eyes, hoping that by morning he'd feel human again. The fever made his thoughts drift and swirl, and he found himself thinking about random things from his childhood, work projects that seemed monumentally important and completely meaningless at the same time, and the strange comfort of being sick in your own space where nobody expected anything from you, except getting better. Jake was floating somewhere between sleep and waking when he heard his apartment door open. The sound cut through the fog in his brain like a distant bell. In his fevered state, everything felt muffled and strange, as if he was hearing the world through thick cotton. His first thought was relief. Amy had actually made it over to check on him after all. He tried to lift his head from the pillow to call out to her, but the simple movement felt like trying to lift a bowling ball with his neck muscles. The footsteps moving through his living room didn't sound quite right, though. Amy usually announced herself the moment she walked into anywhere, calling out hello and asking how people were feeling. These footsteps were different, slower, more deliberate, but also somehow heavier with exhaustion. Maybe she was trying to be quiet in case he was sleeping. That would be just like his sister, always thinking about others even when she was probably tired from dealing with her own kids all evening. Jake's bedroom door was slightly open, the way he always left it because complete darkness made him feel claustrophobic. Through the gap, he could see a shadowy figure moving around his living room. The person seemed to be setting things down. He heard the soft thud of what sounded like a bag hitting his couch, then the distinctive sound of keys being placed on his coffee table. Definitely Amy, then. She always put her keys in the same spot whenever she visited, a habit left over from their childhood when their mother insisted on designated places for everything. But then something odd happened. Instead of the usual sounds of Amy moving around his kitchen, probably looking for tea or checking what food he had available, the footsteps started moving toward his bedroom. They were slower than usual, almost shuffling, and there was something about the rhythm that seemed off. Jake tried again to lift his head, managing to prop himself up slightly on his elbows, but the fever made everything spin in uncomfortable ways. The bedroom door pushed open wider, and a silhouette appeared against the dim light filtering in from his living room windows. The person stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, and Jake realized with growing confusion that this definitely wasn't his sister. The height was wrong, the build was different, and there was something about the way this person moved that spoke of a different kind of exhaustion than anything he'd ever seen from Amy. Without saying a word, the figure began removing layers of clothing. First came what looked like a heavy jacket or coat, dropped carelessly to his bedroom floor. Then what appeared to be some kind of work shirt or uniform top, also falling to the ground with a soft whisper of fabric. Jake's fever-clouded brain struggled to process what was happening. Was this some kind of hallucination brought on by his illness? He'd heard that high fevers could cause people to see things that weren't really there. The person kicked off their shoes, and Jake heard them hit his hardwood floor with two distinct thuds. Everything about their movements suggested someone who was operating on pure autopilot, going through the motions of end-of-day routines without really thinking about them. It was the kind of exhausted mechanical behavior he remembered from his own college days during finals week, when you'd find yourself brushing your teeth in the kitchen sink or putting milk in the pantry instead of the refrigerator. Then something even stranger happened. The person moved toward his bed, not hesitating or seeming to notice that there was already someone in it. Jake tried to speak, tried to ask what was happening, but his throat was so dry and scratchy that only a small croaking sound came out. The fever made everything feel surreal, like he was watching a movie about his own life rather than actually living it. The mattress dipped as the person climbed onto his bed, but not next to him where a normal visitor might sit. Instead, they moved to the foot of the bed, curling up in a position that reminded Jake of how cats find sunny spots to nap in. The person seemed to settle immediately, their breathing already starting to even out in the way that meant sleep was coming fast. Jake lay there in his fevered state, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His brain felt like it was working through thick syrup, thoughts forming slowly and incompletely. The person at the foot of his bed was clearly exhausted beyond normal tiredness. There was something about the way they'd moved, the automatic nature of their actions, that suggested someone who'd been awake and working for far too long. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Jake could make out more details. The person appeared to be a woman with dark hair that had been pulled back, but was now coming loose from whatever she'd used to secure it. She was wearing what looked like medical scrubs underneath the layers she'd removed, which explained the professional uniform appearance of her work clothes. The way she'd collapsed suggested someone who worked in healthcare, maybe finishing a double shift or a particularly difficult day. A terrible possibility began to form in Jake's fevered mind. What if this woman lived in his building and had gotten confused about which apartment was hers? The building's layout was identical on every floor. Same hallway, same door position, same basic apartment configurations. If someone was tired enough, distracted enough, or operating on enough autopilot, it would be easy to get off the elevator on the wrong floor and walk into what they thought was their own place. Jake remembered his unlocked door, left that way for Amy's potential visit. He thought about the mystery neighbor in 4B, the one who came and went at odd hours and always seemed to be carrying medical supplies or work equipment. What if this was that person? What if she lived directly above him and had simply gotten confused about which floor she was on? The woman shifted slightly in her sleep, mumbling something that sounded like words but was too quiet for Jake to understand. Even in her exhausted state, there seemed to be a restlessness about her, as if her body was still processing the stress and activity of whatever she'd just been through. Jake had seen similar exhaustion in Amy when she'd worked double shifts as a waitress during college, that bone-deep tiredness that goes beyond just being sleepy. Jake found himself in perhaps the most bizarre situation of his adult life. He was sick with fever, possibly hallucinating, and there was a complete stranger sleeping at the foot of his bed, a stranger who seemed to think she was in her own apartment, going through her own end-of-shift routine. The rational part of his mind said he should wake her up, explain the mistake, and help her find her way to wherever she actually lived. But another part of him, the part influenced by fever and genuine human compassion, recognized that this person desperately needed rest and had obviously been through something difficult. Jake lay there in the darkness, his mind racing despite the fever that made thinking feel like swimming through mud. The woman at the foot of his bed had settled into what appeared to be a deep sleep, her breathing steady and even. In the quiet of his bedroom, he could hear the small sounds she made, the occasional shift of position, a soft sigh, the rustle of fabric as she unconsciously adjusted her position for comfort. As minutes passed and his eyes continued to adjust to the dim light filtering through his blinds, Jake began to make out more details about his unexpected visitor. She was definitely wearing medical scrubs, the kind that hospital workers and nurses wore. The fabric looked like it had seen a long day, slightly wrinkled and bearing the invisible weight of whatever challenges she'd faced during her shift. Her hair, which had probably started the day in a neat ponytail or bun, was now coming loose in the way that happened when you'd been moving around for hours without time to fix it. There was something about her posture, even in sleep, that spoke of someone who spent long hours on their feet. Her legs were positioned in a way that suggested relief at finally being horizontal, and one of her hands was curled protectively near her lower back, as if that area had been bothering her. Jake recognized these signs from watching his sister, Amy, during her own demanding work periods, the way exhaustion settled into your body and became part of how you carried yourself. The more Jake studied the situation, the more convinced he became that this was indeed his mysterious upstairs neighbor from 4B. The timing made sense with what he'd observed over the past 3 months. The odd hours, the medical-looking equipment he'd glimpsed her carrying, the tired way she moved through the hallway. It all pointed to someone working in healthcare, probably pulling irregular and demanding shifts. What struck him most was how naturally she'd gone through what appeared to be her usual end-of-day routine. She hadn't hesitated or looked around uncertainly. Instead, she'd moved with the automatic precision of someone following a pattern they'd repeated hundreds of times. Drop the work bag, remove the outer layers, kick off the shoes, collapse onto the bed. It was the kind of routine that becomes so ingrained you could do it with your eyes closed, which might explain how she'd managed to do it in the wrong apartment entirely. Jake tried to imagine what kind of day could leave someone so exhausted that they'd make this kind of mistake. He thought about the healthcare workers he'd seen in news reports and documentaries, the long shifts, the emotional weight of caring for sick people, the physical demands of being constantly on your feet and alert. If this woman had just finished a 12-hour shift or worked through some kind of medical emergency, it was entirely understandable that she might be operating on pure muscle memory. The fever made Jake's thoughts drift and swirl, but one thing remained clear in his mind. This was obviously a case of mistaken identity with his apartment. The building's layout was identical on every floor, something that had confused him during his first few weeks of living there. More than once, he'd gotten off the elevator and started walking toward what he thought was his door, only to realize he was on the wrong floor. If you were tired enough, distracted enough, or in enough of a routine, it would be incredibly easy to make this mistake. What made the situation even more understandable was his unlocked door. Jake realized that if this woman lived in 4B, she probably had the same key-operated lock that he did. But since his door was unlocked for Amy's potential visit, she wouldn't have needed to fumble with keys or realize that her key didn't work. The door would have simply opened when she turned the handle, just like her own door would. As Jake continued to observe his sleeping visitor, he noticed other details that confirmed his theory about her profession. There was a small watch pinned to her scrubs, the kind that nurses use to check pulse rates and time medications. Her hands showed signs of frequent hand washing, slightly dry skin and nails that were kept very short and practical. Even in sleep, she had the alert posture of someone trained to respond quickly to emergencies. The woman shifted in her sleep, mumbling something that sounded like medical terminology. Jake caught fragments that might have been vitals in room 12, the kind of work-related talk that sometimes invaded dreams after particularly intense days. It reinforced his growing certainty that she worked in a hospital or clinic, probably somewhere that required long hours and intense concentration. Jake found himself facing a genuine ethical dilemma. On one hand, this was his apartment, his bed, and he had every right to wake her up and ask her to leave. The situation was undeniably strange, and most people would probably handle it by immediately rousing the intruder and demanding an explanation. But on the other hand, this woman was clearly someone who spent her days caring for others, someone who was so exhausted that she'd made an innocent mistake, and someone who desperately needed rest. The fever made everything feel more intense and meaningful than it probably was, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that waking her up would be cruel. She'd obviously been through something difficult, and her body language even in sleep suggested someone carrying a heavy load of responsibility and stress. What harm would it do to let her rest for a while before gently letting her know about the mix-up? Jake also realized that he wasn't exactly in peak condition to handle this situation anyway. The fever made him feel weak and disoriented, and he wasn't entirely sure he could get out of bed without feeling dizzy. Maybe it was better to wait until he felt more capable of having a coherent conversation with this stranger who had accidentally invaded his space. As he lay there contemplating his options, Jake became aware of how the woman's presence actually made his sick, lonely apartment feel less empty. There was something comforting about having another person nearby, even under these bizarre circumstances. It reminded him of being sick as a child, when Amy would sometimes fall asleep in his room to keep him company, or when their parents would check on him throughout the night. The building's heating system chose that moment to clank and hiss through its evening warm-up cycle, the familiar sounds that Jake had grown accustomed to over his 3 months of living there. The woman stirred slightly at the noise, shifting position but not waking. Her hand moved to rest near her phone, which Jake now noticed she'd placed on his nightstand. Presumably thinking it was her own nightstand in her own bedroom, Jake realized that the phone might be key to solving this situation gently. If he could figure out how to contact her or someone who knew her, maybe he could resolve this mix-up without startling her awake in a strange place. But first, he needed to gather more energy and think through the best approach to handle what was turning out to be the most unusual evening of his adult life. Jake spent the next hour drifting in and out of fevered sleep, hyper-aware of the gentle presence at the foot of his bed. Every time he stirred awake, he'd remember the surreal situation and wonder if he was dreaming the whole thing. But the soft sounds of another person breathing, the slight shift in weight distribution on his mattress, and the faint scent of hospital disinfectant that seemed to cling to her scrubs all confirmed that this was very real. Around 11 o'clock, Jake's fever spiked again, leaving him feeling like he was burning up from the inside. He tried to quietly reach for the water bottle on his nightstand without disturbing his unexpected guest, but his movement caused the bed to shift slightly. The woman stirred, making a small sound that suggested she was caught between sleep and waking. Jake froze, hoping she'd settle back into deeper sleep, but instead he heard her mumble something about checking on a patient in room 7. It was clear she was still partially asleep, her mind processing the demands and responsibilities of her workday even in rest. Jake had experienced similar work dreams during stressful periods at his marketing job, but he imagined that healthcare work carried a different kind of mental weight. The responsibility of caring for sick people, making decisions that affected their well-being, staying alert during long shifts, it all seemed like the type of job that would follow you into your dreams. As Jake listened to her sleep-talking, he caught fragments that painted a picture of her day. Something about the surgery in room 12 taking longer than expected, and making sure Mrs. Chen gets her evening medication. There was a caring quality even in her unconscious mumbling, a professional concern that seemed ingrained in who she was. It made Jake think about his own job, where the biggest stress was usually a missed deadline or a client who didn't like a social media campaign. The contrast made him feel both grateful for his relatively simple work life and impressed by people who chose careers dedicated to helping others. The woman's phone buzzed softly on his nightstand, the screen lighting up briefly in the darkness. Jake could see it was a text message, probably from someone checking on her after her shift. The light was enough to illuminate her face more clearly, and Jake realized she looked younger than he'd initially thought, probably around his own age. There were stress lines around her eyes that suggested someone who'd seen difficult things, but also a peaceful expression that came from finally being able to rest. Jake found himself thinking about how to handle this delicate situation. His fever had made everything feel dreamlike and strange, but he was coherent enough to understand that waking up in a stranger's apartment would be terrifying for anyone, especially a woman. He needed to find a way to let her know about the mistake gently, without causing panic or making her feel unsafe. The responsible thing would be to wake her up and explain what had happened. But every time Jake considered doing that, he looked at her exhausted posture and remembered the fragments of her work-related dreams. She'd obviously had an incredibly demanding day, the kind that left you running on empty and desperate for rest. Waking her up would mean forcing her to deal with embarrassment, confusion, and the energy required to relocate to her actual apartment when she clearly needed sleep more than anything else. Jake's sister Amy had told him stories about the exhaustion that came with demanding jobs. She'd worked as a server during college, pulling double shifts to pay for books and rent, and he remembered her coming home so tired she'd sometimes fall asleep still wearing her work uniform. But healthcare work seemed different. The emotional weight of caring for sick people, the physical demands of 12-hour shifts, the constant need to stay alert because mistakes could have serious consequences. As the night wore on, Jake found himself oddly comforted by the presence of another person in his apartment. Being sick alone had felt isolating and slightly scary, especially when the fever made everything seem more intense than usual. Having someone nearby, even a stranger who didn't know she was providing comfort, made the experience less lonely. It reminded him of childhood illnesses when his parents would check on him throughout the night, or when Amy would bring him soup and sit with him while he recovered. The woman's breathing had settled into the deep, steady rhythm of genuine rest. Whatever dreams had been troubling her earlier seemed to have passed, replaced by the kind of sleep that comes when your body finally gets permission to stop being alert and responsible. Jake noticed that some of the tension had left her posture, and her hands had relaxed from the protective positions they'd held earlier. Jake's phone showed it was almost midnight when he made a decision that surprised him. Instead of waking her, he quietly reached for his phone and began typing a text to Amy. letting her know that she didn't need to come check on him tonight. He explained that he was feeling a bit better and just needed to sleep. It wasn't entirely true, he still felt awful, but having this woman accidentally caring for his space in her own unconscious way made him feel less alone with his illness. The fever made Jake's thoughts wander to philosophical territory. Here was someone who spent her days taking care of strangers, and now she was unconsciously providing comfort to another stranger who happened to be sick. There was something beautiful about the accidental kindness of the situation, the way human compassion could work even when people weren't aware they were providing it. Around 1 a.m, the woman's phone buzzed again, this time with what looked like a call rather than a text. The vibration was enough to finally stir her toward waking, and Jake realized that the gentle resolution he'd been hoping for was about to happen naturally. She moved slowly, the way people do when emerging from deep sleep, reaching automatically for her phone before her brain had fully processed where she was. Jake watched as she answered the phone with a sleepy hello, then listened as whoever was calling asked about her shift and whether she'd made it home safely. Her response was automatic at first. "Yeah, I'm home. Just exhausted." But then Jake saw the exact moment when her brain began to register that something wasn't right about her surroundings. The conversation on the phone continued, but Jake could see her eyes starting to move around the room, taking in details that didn't match what she expected to see. The different wall color, the unfamiliar furniture arrangement, the presence of another person in what she thought was her own bed. Her voice on the phone became more alert, more questioning. As reality began to filter through the fog of exhaustion, Jake knew that within the next few minutes, she'd be fully awake and aware of the mistake she'd made. He prepared himself for the conversation that was about to happen, hoping his fever-weakened state wouldn't make him seem threatening or strange. This was about to become either a terrifying experience for both of them, or the beginning of an unusual but harmless story they'd both remember forever. The woman's phone conversation came to an abrupt halt as she sat up straight, her eyes wide with the sudden realization that nothing around her looked familiar. Jake could hear the muffled voice on the other end of the call asking if everything was okay, but she seemed too shocked to respond immediately. Her gaze moved from the unfamiliar curtains to the different colored walls, then finally landed on Jake, who was propped up on his elbow watching her with what he hoped was a reassuring expression despite his fevered state. "Oh my God," she whispered, ending the call without explanation. Her voice carried a mix of horror and confusion that made Jake's heart go out to her. "I am so sorry. I was so tired after my shift and all the floors look exactly the same in this building." She was speaking quickly, the words tumbling out as her mind processed the full scope of her mistake. "I must have gotten off on the wrong floor and your door was unlocked and I just—" Jake tried to sit up properly, though the movement made his head spin slightly. "It's okay," he managed to say, his voice still hoarse from being sick. "I figured out what happened. You live upstairs, right? In 4B? The relief that crossed her face when she realized he understood the situation was immediate and genuine. "Yes, exactly 1 floor up. I can't believe I did this. I've been working doubles all week, and today was particularly rough. We had 3 emergency surgeries that ran late, and I haven't slept properly in days." She was gathering her scattered clothing as she spoke, clearly mortified by the situation. "Are you okay? You sound terrible." It was at that moment that her professional training kicked in, overriding her embarrassment. Despite being in the middle of apologizing for accidentally invading a stranger's apartment, she was already assessing Jake's condition with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years caring for sick people. She noticed his flushed face, the tissues scattered around his bed, and the way he seemed to be struggling just to sit upright. "I'm fine. Just the flu that's been going around," Jake said. But even as he spoke, he realized how unconvincing he sounded. The fever had definitely gotten worse during the night, and now that he was trying to have a coherent conversation, he could feel how much the illness had taken out of him. Without asking permission, she reached over and pressed the back of her hand against his forehead, the same way nurses check temperatures when they don't have equipment readily available. Her touch was cool against his burning skin, and professional in a way that immediately put Jake at ease. "You're running a pretty high fever," she said, her voice shifting into the calm, competent tone she probably used with patients. "When did this start?" Jake found himself explaining about feeling sick at work, coming home early, and spending the evening getting progressively worse. As he talked, she continued her informal assessment, noting his labored breathing and the way he seemed to be struggling with basic movements. Her embarrassment about the apartment mix-up was clearly taking a back seat to her concern for his well-being. "Have you been drinking enough fluids? Taking anything for the fever?" she asked. And when Jake admitted he'd been mostly just sleeping and hoping it would pass, she shook her head with the disapproval of someone who'd seen too many people try to tough out illnesses that needed proper care. What happened next surprised Jake completely. Instead of gathering her things and leaving as quickly as possible, she began moving around his apartment with purpose. She went to his kitchen and returned with a large glass of water, which she insisted he drink immediately. She found his thermometer in the bathroom and took his temperature properly, confirming that he was indeed running a fever that needed attention. "I know this is weird, given that I just accidentally broke into your apartment," she said with a slight smile that transformed her tired face. "But you shouldn't be dealing with this alone. This fever is high enough that you need to be monitoring it, and you're clearly dehydrated." Jake wanted to protest that she'd already done enough by accidentally providing companionship during his lonely sick night, but he found himself grateful for her professional attention. Being cared for by someone who actually knew what they were doing felt infinitely better than his previous plan of just waiting it out and hoping for the best. She introduced herself properly then, explaining that she was indeed his upstairs neighbor, and that she worked as a nurse at the downtown hospital. She'd been pulling extra shifts to cover for colleagues who were also sick with the same flu that had knocked Jake down. Her name was Lisa, and she'd been living in the building for almost 2 years, though they'd never properly met despite being neighbors. Over the next hour, Lisa transformed from an accidental intruder into an impromptu caregiver. She helped Jake get his fever down with proper medication, made sure he was staying hydrated, and even prepared a simple soup from ingredients she found in his kitchen. Her movements around his apartment were efficient and caring, the result of years spent helping people feel better when they were at their worst. As Jake began to feel more human thanks to her care, they started talking about their lives in the building. Lisa shared stories about her work at the hospital, the challenges of healthcare during busy seasons, and her own experiences with the quirky apartment building they both called home. Jake told her about his marketing job, his sister who worried too much, and his ongoing process of learning to live alone after his roommate moved out. What struck Jake most was how naturally their conversation flowed. Despite the bizarre circumstances that had brought them together, Lisa had a warm sense of humor that came out once she was no longer mortified about her mistake, and she seemed genuinely interested in Jake's life and work. There was something refreshing about meeting someone whose daily concerns were so different from his own, someone whose work involved directly helping people in ways that mattered. As dawn began to filter through Jake's windows, Lisa finally gathered her things to head upstairs to her actual apartment. But before she left, she wrote down her phone number and made Jake promise to call her if his fever got worse or if he needed anything. She also extracted a commitment from him to actually rest and take care of himself properly, using the authoritative tone that probably worked well with stubborn patients. "I can't believe I'm saying this," Lisa said, as she paused at his door, "but I'm almost glad I made that mistake last night. Not that I'm not completely embarrassed about it, but meeting you has been the bright spot in what was otherwise a really difficult week." Jake found himself agreeing, realizing that what had started as the strangest night of his adult life had turned into something unexpectedly meaningful. After Lisa left, he settled back into bed feeling not just physically better thanks to her care, but also less alone in the building and the city he was still learning to call home. 2 weeks later, when Jake had fully recovered and was back to his normal routine, he found himself knocking on the door of apartment 4B. He carried a plate of homemade cookies and a bottle of wine, partly as a thank you for the unexpected nursing care, and partly because he genuinely wanted to continue the friendship that had begun in such an unusual way.